the ventilator is alarming that there's a peak, there's an increase in peak inspiratory pressure. So how are we going to be able to troubleshoot this? So the first thing you want to do is to do your inspiratory hold, because by doing inspiratory hold, what's that going to give to us? That's going to eliminate the airway pressure, and that will give us the what? That will eliminate the resistance, and that will give us the plateau, right? So that will give us the plateau. So on the ventilator, there's what we call, there's a button which is the inspiratory hold. So when you press that inspiratory hold, and that will tell you the what? The plateau pressure. So let's look at this graph. So anytime you see the graph, the first thing you want to see is to orientate ourselves by looking at the axis of the graph. So by looking on the y-axis, so this is going to be the airway pressure, and on the x-axis we have what? We have the time. And if you look at here, so here's our PEEP, right? So PEEP, remember PEEP is what we set the PEEP in AC/VC mode. So we have our PEEP being set, and that during inhalation, so that patient inspire, right? So once they inspire, then once they finish inspire, what do we do? We do what they call inspiratory what? Hold. Remember, by doing inspiratory hold, what happens to the airway pressure? So the airway resistance become what? Airway resistance become 0. Very good. So the airway resistance is going to become 0, right? And then by airway resistance becoming 0, that will give us the what? That will give us the plateau pressure, right? And of course, going to be the expiration. So if you look at here, so looking at the here, so the peak of this graph is going to be our peak inspiratory pressure, which is our PIP, right? And then when we do our inspiratory hold, so somewhere around here, when we do our inspiratory hold, then that's going to be our what? Our plateau pressure. So that will be plateau pressure, right? And of course, the differences between the peak inspiratory pressure and the plateau pressure is going to be our what? Our airway resistance. So that will be the airway resistance. So when we do inspiratory hold, that means during inspiratory hold, that airway resistance will become what? 0. Because remember, there's no movement of, there's no flow. So because there's no flow, that eliminates the airway resistance. So that's where the airway resistance will be 0. So that pressure that we have at that point is going to be our what? Plateau. And that will be telling us about the compliance of the lungs. Very good. And here we can see the B here. So our B is going to be the differences between the plateau and the PEEP. So that differences between the plateau and the PEEP is going to be the elastic pressure. And that elastic pressure is also the same thing as the driving pressure. And the driving pressure is the difference between the plateau. So difference between the plateau pressure and the PEEP. And that's going to be the driving pressure. So let's see how we're going to apply this information. So if there is an increase in the PIP, so if our PIP is increased, right, but there's a normal in plateau pressure, right? So the peak inspiratory pressure is high. So peak inspiratory pressure is high. But when we check our plateau is normal. So that means the reason why the peak inspiratory pressure is high is going to be because of what? Airway resistance. So it's an airway resistance problem. And then when we look at the airway resistance problem, right? So we can start from the tubing, from the ventilator all the way to the airway. So it could be maybe probably there's a kink, right, in the tubing, right? Or the HME is blocked with a lot of secretion. That could be possible because that could increase the airway resistance. Or maybe the patient is biting down on the tube, because if the patient is away, they could be biting the ET tube. Or maybe there's a big mucus plug. So if there's a big mucus plug, that could also increase the airway resistance. Or if the patient is having bronchospasm, like in the patient with asthma exacerbation or COPD exacerbation T2. So let's say the peak airway pressure is high, but at the same time when we do our inspiratory hold, the plateau is also high. Then we know that the reason why the peak airway pressure is high is because of poor lung compliance. So that means there's a decrease in lung compliance. And this could be an example of somebody who have ARDS, pulmonary edema, pneumothorax.